Welcome, everyone. My name is DJ Wells, and you've joined us once again for our weekly broadcast, Coping with COVID, where each week we talk about those things that are concerning to all of us as it relates to the COVID-19 pandemic and the ways that we're muddling through this crazy time. Dr. Mensah and I were chatting not too long ago, and we realized that so many of the folks that come to see us at Mensah Medical do so because they're dealing with autism in their families and in their homes. And we recognize that there's a lot of concern out there right now regarding the connection between COVID and autism, and whether or not, we've heard so much about comorbidities and other conditions that might impact whether or not COVID affects someone in a more severe manner than others. And so we wanted to talk about that today. And so Dr. Mensah has actually pulled together a little bit more of a formal presentation for you to talk about some of the connections between autism and COVID-19. And of course, we'll also answer your questions. And so I want to again remind you, as we do each week, this is an interactive activity. And so as you have questions, please do use the Q&A tab that's at the bottom of your screen if you're looking on your computer. If you're using a tablet or a phone, that tab may be at the top, but click on Q&A and you should be able to type in your questions. And after Dr. Mensah gets through with his formal presentation, then we'll address those questions. We've actually already got several questions in, so I'm sure we'll have a robust conversation. And again, of course, please share with your friends and family who aren't able to join us today that we're going to post this video on the Mensah Medical YouTube channel. And so if anything that Dr. Mensah says today or any of the slides that we present, if you want to go back and review that, it will be available to you later on this evening or tomorrow on the Mensah Medical YouTube channel. Okay, all the formalities are done. Let's go ahead and get going with Dr. Mensah. Dr. Mensah, thank you as always for joining us, and let's talk about autism and COVID.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Wells. So as Mr. Wells quite so eloquently stated, there's a big challenge right now with regard to all the potential issues that COVID can create. And we know there are neurological and inflammatory conditions that can be seen in children, even if children don't have the formal, let's call it disease or destructive capacity full of COVID, full from COVID. There can be sequela that happens after that. So then the question becomes, well, what about our special needs children? How susceptible are they? What are some of the challenges that they face? Children who are in the spectrum, children who have autism, children who have PDD, NOS, children who have developmental delay. All of these categories also really need some level of addressing. So today we decided we're going to put together a little bit of discussion for you, and we're going to kind of vet out some of those issues and those considerations. Okay. Some of you have seen before, as we talked briefly about a history of autism. In the early 1900s, autism was referred to as an entire range of psychological conditions, including schizophrenia, by the way. In the 1940s, autism was used to describe children with emotional or social problems. Asperger's syndrome was actually identified at that time. Now, you folks know, of course, that I always talk about how Asperger's is different than autism. The actual structure of the brain, the actual functioning, and corrective tendencies are very different for the two. So we take Asperger's and we put it out of the autism spectrum disorder. We don't include it in. In the 1960s and 1970s, it's really some barbaric things were happening. Treatment used to rely on pain and punishment, electroshock therapy, behavioral change techniques, even the use of psychoactive drugs like LSD. In the 1980s and the 1990s, behavioral therapy and highly controlled learning environments became the primary treatments. Now today, research and treatment focuses on the genetic and environmental factors, behavioral therapy, nutrients, dietary changes, and much more. A lot more civilized, a lot more targeted, and a lot more scientific approaches to autism. Next slide, please. Our database includes more than 90 to 150 assays of chemical factors in blood, urine, and hair for each of over 6,500 patients we encountered back in the original research. We had more than 800,000 chemical test results. Autism imbalances were seen to be more evident or more pronounced than even in violent behavior individuals and mental illness individuals. There's clear evidence that oxidative stress and metallothionein depletion are present in autism. And we'll talk about metallothionein and oxidative stress a little bit later. Next slide, please. Distinctive features of autism. Well, certainly there are biochemical imbalances that are present. There's incomplete brain development. There's a very strong genetic predisposition. The onset of autism typically happens after some type of environmental insult. I know what some of you are thinking. Some of you are thinking, well, my child was born autistic. Or remember, your child was developing in the womb for at least 9 months for most of you. Some of you for only 3 or 4 months, those who have premature children. But the environment of the womb is also a potential risk factor, depending on the balance of elements that are circulating in that embryonic fluid. High oxidative stress is also another issue, in addition to the gut-brain connection, which we'll talk about. There are certain biochemical abnormalities that are seen quite consistently in autism. Number one, a depressed glutathione and cysteine level. Oftentimes we see elevated toxic metals, and the internet is wild out there with the whole concept of toxic metals. Depressed SAM-E and SAH ratios, those are chemical ratios. High levels of copper and low ceruloplasmin we'll talk about as well. Depleted zinc and metallothionein, elevated pyrroles. We just talked about Pyrrole disorder in our last presentation. Low vitamin B6, vitamin C, and selenium. Those are going to be really key as we talk about COVID. We'll just pay attention to those later on. And elevated urine isoprostanes, which we'll not worry about right now. Next slide, please. Zinc deficiency. Zinc deficiency is extremely characteristic of autism. It's also associated with ADHD, irritability, anxiety, explosive temper, violence, and aggressive behavior. Now, you folks with children who've got autism out there, you know how quickly your children can turn from calm to rageful to dysregulated to anxious. Zinc is a key piece in that most of the time, the kids who've got autism or who are in this spectrum are zinc deficient. Okay. Zinc is critical to immune health. So as we talk about COVID, this is very, very important. Zinc is also key for neurotransmitter dysregulation. And when we talk about neurotransmitters, we're talking about the chemicals in your brain, the serotonin, the dopamine, the norepinephrine. Now remember, norepinephrine is a fight or flight neurotransmitter that can lead to behavioral challenges. So on the one hand, brain dysregulation. Now the next point here being immune compromise, greater susceptibility to colds, flus, viruses. Already you can see how the two worlds are starting to come together. You also see increased depression and stress, which leads to increased pyrroles, which then in turn leads to decreased zinc and vitamin B6. Next slide, please. Let's talk about metal metabolism. When we refer to metal metabolism, we're talking about the genetic inability to control copper levels, zinc levels, manganese, and other trace minerals. The absence of copper and zinc homeostasis or balance and severe zinc deficiency are very suggestive that a very interesting protein in the brain known as metallothionein or MT is not working right. It's either not working right or it's not present in significant enough amounts. Now, this is a very important protein that most people have not heard of, but MT functions include neuronal development, so helping the brain cells themselves develop properly, detoxification of heavy metals, and supporting immune regulation. Many of the classic symptoms of autism can be explained by a defect in metallothionein, starting in infancy, including the gastrointestinal tract. Those kind of problems, we often see heightened sensitivity to toxic metals and abnormal behaviors. Many of these things can be traced back to metallothionein. So why is metallothionein important? Well, It's required, it's absolutely necessary for the development of brain cells and what we call synaptic connections. In other words, how one brain cell talks to another brain cell. You need metallothionein for proper communication. Metallothionein also prevents mercury and other metals from passing from the intestinal and the blood-brain barriers, okay? So we need metallothionein for balance between copper and zinc, what we call homeostasis, or balance between the two. Metallothionein also supports immune function. Now remember, COVID is coming to the picture here in this conversation, and it's our immune system that fights COVID. So this is where we're starting to see the crossover pieces between biochemical imbalances, metallothionein, and infection and susceptibility to viruses. Next slide. Well, we talked about Pyrrole disorder before. Many of you are familiar with it. I'm going to give you a very quick synopsis. Pyrrole disorder is a disorder of stress intolerance. That stress can be environmental, it can be bacterial, it can be social, it can be financial, relationship related. Anything that stresses you out, despite the source, can cause Pyrrole disorders to rise. And when Pyrroles rise, they deplete your system of key nutrients like zinc and vitamin B6. And then without the zinc and the B6, you can't make your neurotransmitters very well. You also can't support immune function. Next slide, please.
Dr. Mensah, very quickly, just a reminder at the very top of the slide here, something that's very important, that is that 95% of people with autism also have Pyrrole disorder. I know that you and I were talking about that earlier.
Extremely well, and thank you for reminding me of that. Indeed, what's very key here is about 95% of autistic individuals have Pyrrole disorder. Now, he's reminding me of what I said to him earlier. I didn't just forget that, okay? We talked about that as being very key. So it's very important to remember that. Pyrrole disorder is almost a fixture in autism. So everything that we talk about related to pyroluria affects most of the kids who are out there on the spectrum. Thank you, Mr. Wells. Next slide. Oxidative stress and autism. Excessive oxidative stress is evident throughout the autism spectrum disorder. In fact, it's the model of oxidative stress that actually best explains the symptoms of autism. Most autism therapies have antioxidant properties. That's why many of those are successful. Oxidative stress has become a leading focus in autism research and biochemical research and medical research throughout the entire community of medicine. Next slide, please. The consequences of oxidative stress actually mirror classic symptoms of autism. Number one, note, poor immune function, disruption of the methylation cycle, inflammation of the brain and the GI tract. There's a tremendous amount of immune capacity that lies inside the GI tract. Many of you don't realize your gut is actually the key or one of the major pieces with regard to immune function and how well you do fighting off those outside invaders. If the GI tract is inflamed, your capacity for immune function is severely hindered. Depletion of glutathione and metallothionein proteins occur, and that is very classic in the symptoms of autism. And we see excessive amounts of unbound copper. We'll talk about that later. Next slide. Oxidative stress can dysregulate immune function. So excessive oxidative stress can deplete the system of glutathione, impair the one carbon cycle, as we call it. We won't worry too much about that, but the key point is that it can produce undermethylation. So yes, folks, oxidative stress, depleting glutathione can now lead to undermethylation. So undermethylation can then reduce the production of glutathione, cysteine, and metallothionein and cause excess oxidative stress again. So ample glutathione is actually required for proper functioning of metallothionein. And metallothionein is a key factor in the regulation of our immune system and immune health. Now, don't go anywhere yet, Mr. Wells, on the slide. I want to go back to glutathione. Something else about glutathione that most of you may not realize. Glutathione is necessary for your lymphocyte function. Now, lymphocytes are white blood cells that are powerful in immune support. If you don't have proper levels of glutathione, the number of lymphocytes decreases by 75%. That's huge. In other words, 3/4 of one version of your immune fighting cells are depleted, dysfunctional, gone, without proper levels of glutathione. And metallothionein is very key in helping in that cycle of glutathione production as well as functionality. Next slide. Consequences of oxidative stress, overload in the GI tract. First of all, oxidative stress destroys digestive enzymes that are needed to break down casein and gluten. So oxidative stress is the key while everyone's trying to do the casein-free, gluten-free diet, while we're trying to take a bunch of different digestive enzymes. Are we doing anything about the oxidative stress that's destroying the digestive enzymes that's needed to break down the casein and gluten in the first place? Oxidative stress diminishes zinc levels and the production of stomach acid. You need zinc to produce stomach acid. You also need zinc, of course, for immune health. Oxidative stress produces inflammation. Oxidative stress results in that ever so popular concept in autism known as the leaky intestinal barrier, also known as leaky gut, which allows toxins to enter into the bloodstream. Next slide, please.
Before we go on, Dr. Mensah, I've got a question that came in here that that relates specifically to this, and that is, we've heard you talk about oxidative stress, but we've also heard you talk about external stressors like, relationships and finance and somebody, swinging a baseball bat at you. I mean, all of these are stressful things. What's the difference between oxidative stress and these external stressors?
That's a great question. Now, oxidative stress is actually a chemical change phenomenon, where literally chemical molecules change what we call their valence or their signature of positivity or negativity. They then create free radicals. Yes, like that 1960s hit group, the Free Radicals. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Bad. The older you get, the worse your jokes become. But the free radicals that are caused now damage cell membranes. So when you damage cell membranes, you now dysregulate the cell. It can't work properly. And times, millions and millions of cells equal tissues, and thousands of tissues together equal organ systems. So when we're talking about oxidative stress, what we're really talking about is free radical damage and the destruction of cellular structures, and cellular function becomes very, very erratic, which now leads to big changes in individuals. Everything from the development of cancer to cognitive function development can be seen with free radical damage. That's how we age, by the way. It's free radical damage that can't be repaired by your DNA anymore. And that happens as you get older and older and older. Now, emotional stress, or those other stress factors that we're talking about, literally are kind of at the beginning that lead to a lot of the changes chemically that eventually lead to that free radical damage or free radical distress, okay? So it's kind of like the thought is here, and then the action is here through several hundreds of thousands of cycles of chemical reactions, okay? But emotional stress, physical stress, environmental stress also increase pyrroles. Remember that. And pyrroles deplete you of zinc. And zinc is one of the things that helps you combat free radical damage. So there's sort of two parallel levels at work here. One is the creation of pyrroles and depletion of zinc. The other one is free radical development at the cellular level. And then you get this thing where now the depleted zinc leads to increased free radicals to further worsen the situation. It's a huge domino effect, but a great, great question. Next slide, please. Possible consequences of COVID and neurological health. There hasn't been a tremendous amount of work done just yet, although people are working on it, with regard to different consequences of COVID in kids. We know that COVID seems to affect children not as hard as adults in the traditional fashion, but what we're really kind of seeing now is that there are other consequences that children go through. A new study in the Journal of the American Medical Association, known as JAMA, speaks about the MIS-C, which is basically a multisystemic inflammatory reactive syndrome kind of a situation. And what we see are neurological developments that can actually happen with children. Everything from seizure activity to other neurologic consequences can happen weeks, months, and may last for years after COVID infections. A second recent study from The Lancet, another very well-respected journal in medicine, talks about the seizure activity, hallucinations, and psychotic symptoms. So let's talk about this for just one moment, Mr. Wells. If we have a situation where an autistic child or a child on the spectrum who can't communicate is having hallucinations or psychotic symptoms, what does their behavior look like? Their behavior looks extremely dysregulated, almost violent at times, and we don't know what's wrong. We don't understand where that's coming from. And we assume that there are other causes. Well, what we're seeing now is that here's another reason why to be careful with our behavior and our exposure of our kids to, I hate to say it, the general population who's not being careful with regard to COVID. This is another reason why we have to be careful about regulations regarding how to protect our children best, both in public and in private, okay? Because for these special group of kids who are in the spectrum, it's going to be very difficult for many to diagnose because many can't tell you, this is what I'm encountering. Mother, I'm having a seizure. You know, father, I'm having psychotic symptoms. It doesn't work quite so simply when your child is nonverbal. The next part here is the hindered brain development. Now remember, we said in this slide already, in this series, that without metallothionein proteins working very well, which is what we see quite often in autism, brain development is not what it should be, leading to the difficulties and the challenges that our children have. So now we see that this virus can come in and further insult brain development. So that sets our kids back even further. So we really have to be very concerned about the long-term implications and multiplying impact of COVID with regard to neurological health in our children, both our normal typical children and our special children who are in the spectrum. Next slide, please. Talking about treating and preventing COVID. So how do we truly combat this virus effectively? As we talked about in our series on pyroluria and treatment, the key, as I like to say, lies in nature, with a little bit of assist, maybe from pharmacology. So vitamin C, zinc, and melatonin represent the trifecta of both protection and treatment in general when it comes to viruses. You may be asking, how do vitamins protect against such a virulent pathogen? Next slide. Well, thusly, okay? Let's talk about each individual element here. In order to have iron attach itself to hemoglobin, it requires vitamin C to do so, okay? Now, when iron and vitamin C attach together, that hemoglobin molecule can now attach to oxygen and take oxygen to your tissues. Therefore, your cells get to breathe. Now, with COVID tries to deplete your body of vitamin C to stop this joining of hemoglobin and iron together, so that now you don't get you don't get oxygen being transported from one part of the system to another, and your cells starve, okay? One of the reasons is that the COVID is very sneaky. It's looking for the transit system, the highway throughout your body, and figures if it can displace your iron and you don't get oxygen binding, it can jump into that very site where the hemoglobin molecule should be transporting iron, get into your blood cells, and then it sits back and enjoys the ride to your brain, your liver, your kidneys, or other parts of your body, your heart, your lungs, jump off that highway, set up shop, and create massive infections and disruptions of your normal functioning. So let me say that again. COVID uses your own red blood cells as a transit system throughout your body, but it can't do so if your system is carrying oxygen. So its job is to separate the vitamin C from the hemoglobin so that it can sit in that spot, attach itself, and then it gets a free ride wherever it wants to go. But in the meantime, you suffer. Your cells don't get oxygenated. And then you start to basically starve of oxygen in a sea of oxygen. That oxygen is just unbound, okay? So almost every system that COVID affects in the human body is related to this depletion of vitamin C. Every system in the body requires vitamin C to function. Most people today, by the way, without even checking, most people are deficient in vitamin C. So if you test your vitamin C levels, you'll see where you lie and what you need to do. But vitamin C is very key. Once again, nature battles nature. Zinc. Zinc is a very powerful agent responsible for immune health and DNA repair, right? Remember when we were talking about free radical damage and the question Mr. Wells asked earlier, right? You cannot have DNA repair. The enzyme that repairs your DNA needs zinc in order to repair DNA. DNA repair that doesn't happen leads to free radical damage. Those free radicals that we were talking about now hinder cellular regeneration, whether it's brain cell, gut cell, liver cell, kidney cell, or any other cell. That enzyme, remember, needs zinc. In addition, zinc is very key for your immune health, okay? You cannot get your white blood cells and all those other cells functioning properly without zinc. Now, stress, as we've been talking about, decreases and depletes zinc by increasing pyrrole molecules. Let's go back to the pyrroles. You see, folks, how all this is coming together now. Pyrroles are significant because of its effect on zinc. Zinc is very significant because of its effect on multiple areas: DNA, enzyme repair, enzyme function, neurotransmitter development. Zinc is ubiquitous. Low levels of zinc means poor capacity to fight infection when it comes to COVID. Next slide, please. So let's talk about one more element. Now, this one we haven't talked about too much, but in our last or previous discussions, we've been speaking more and more about melatonin. And everyone's first thought is, well, what are we talking about sleeping agents for? I take melatonin all the time for sleep, and for some of us it works well, for others it doesn't work too terribly well at all, okay? But melatonin is more than just a sleeping aid. It is a very, very powerful anti-inflammatory agent. In fact, here's one of the interesting challenges. Melatonin is anti-inflammatory. Melatonin comes from serotonin. Be very careful here, pay attention. Serotonin requires vitamin B6 to produce melatonin. So if you are deficient in vitamin B6, it's going to be hard for you to produce that which helps to fend off viral-mediated inflammation. So serotonin plus B6 equals melatonin. Now, that melatonin that's produced from serotonin and B6 helps to stop the COVID and viral-mediated inflammation and what you've heard of so often, the cytokine storm. It does so through the binding or the blockage of a very specific receptor in the system by which COVID uses to create the cytokine storm. Now, here's what's very helpful. There are very, very high levels of melatonin in babies and toddlers and young children. More than 10 times as much melatonin is found in these categories than is found in adults. That's why, folks, we often say, gosh, I slept like a baby, right? On a good night. But see, what happens is that when you age, or as you age, your melatonin levels decrease. So here's the reason why children, based upon this new information that we're talking about here, melatonin being anti-inflammatory and inhibiting that cytokine storm, here's the reason that children tend to fare better in general during COVID-19 infections. They have tremendously high levels of melatonin. Adults have very low levels of melatonin that are produced naturally. Next slide. So when we go back to treating and preventing COVID-19, a few basic things we want to talk about. Load up on your vitamin C, your zinc, and your melatonin. In adults, we've talked about 5 grams divided into daily dosages, into 2 daily dosages when you're just looking for prevention, not treating. Zinc 80 to 100 milligrams, and melatonin about 1 milligram in the evening. Next slide.
Before we move on, Dr. Mensah, I've got a question. So I was just out at a local, one one of those stores that sells things in bulk, and we won't advertise a specific store, but I found melatonin there, but they had it in 5 milligram doses instead of 1 milligram. Is 5 milligrams too much? Should I be taking 5 milligrams a day? Should I take that 5 milligram dosage once every 2 or 3 days? How do I regulate that?
Well, the outside way of putting this is you should probably find a different brand of melatonin that has a lower. If it's a gummy, you might want to even cut that up, share it with the missus or with your kids, and divide it, because really what happens is that your system gets saturated beyond 1 or so milligrams of melatonin, okay? So the rest can either become fluff or it can have a very interesting effect. What should be a help you get to sleep kind of thing, because of the higher dosage, could actually wake you up in the middle of the night. So quite a few people report when they take 3 milligrams, 4 or 5 milligrams of melatonin, hey, they fall asleep very well, then all of a sudden they're just awake at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. You don't want that either. Now, from an anti-inflammatory perspective, yes, that sounds great. But from a sleep perspective, it doesn't work out too well. And remember, our cells do get saturated really somewhere around actually less than 1 milligram. But 1 milligram is okay.
I do have another question here that was sent in before that says that in past webinars, you've mentioned 5,000 milligrams of vitamin C or 5 grams of vitamin C. You've also mentioned 6,000 milligrams of vitamin C. You've talked about even intravenous, really high dosages of vitamin C, perhaps as treatment.
Only in the hospital, not at home.
Okay? Right. But
yes.
But the question is, should we be looking at 5 grams? Should we be looking at 6 grams? Why the fluctuation here in some of the recommendations?
Yeah, that's a great question. Now, we're speaking very generally, unfortunately, about dosing. We've got a lot of patients that we talk to. We have people who've never been on nutrient therapy. And for each of them, there's a different kind of protocol, okay? People who are treatment naive, who've never had nutrients, for example, listen, we're saying, all right, we want you to build up to about 5 milligrams or so. Now, we've got some diehard patients who've been on our nutrient programs. They've already got, on average, 2 grams of vitamin C per day in their protocols, okay? So their systems are kind of adapted to that. For them, we take them higher. So we go to 6 milligrams. If they've been around individuals who've been around COVID and they may have a higher risk, we may increase that to 10. So this is no different when it comes to what we talk about predominantly, which is bio-individuality. Everybody is case specific and there is a range. What we're saying though for adults is that the minimum you need to be on is 5 grams when it comes to prophylaxis or prevention, okay? But then some individuals will be on more, some people will be on even more, but very rarely do we talk about anyone being on less than 5 grams as an adult with regard to prophylaxis, okay? So that's where that variation comes in. Now, when we talk about children, on the other hand, well, here's where we're just sort of trying to give away some wonderful tidbits for free here. As far as vitamin C is concerned, children who weigh between 20 to 50 pounds, we're talking about 500 milligrams of vitamin C divided daily, divided into 2 dosages per day. Zinc, about 50 milligrams in the evening, tops. When we're talking about children between 50 and 90 pounds, that vitamin C moves to about 1,000 milligrams divided into 2 dosages, and zinc at about 80 milligrams in the evening, okay? So these are just kind of the general recommendations we're giving for those people out there who really aren't patients of ours, but who need to have more absorptive capacity present, okay? Who need to have some guidance with regard to how much to take. So.
And a reminder, question that came in last week that is still appropriate here today, and that is melatonin for children, since you just mentioned that oftentimes they've got a bunch of melatonin in their system anyway. what kind of supplement should we be talking about for these children?
Less than half of a milligram, less than 0.5 milligrams for the children with who we're suggesting giving melatonin to.
Very good, thank you.
It works very well with autism because oxidative stress depletes your system of the capacity to make serotonin and melatonin. So even though the typical endogenous levels are very high, there may be some challenge with functionality. In addition, what we really didn't talk about yet is that most of our children who are in the spectrum are undermethylated. And remember that methylation is that process of an attachment of a methyl molecule to an enzyme, a hormone, or a neurotransmitter to turn it on and turn it off. So you can make tons of melatonin, but if you're undermethylated, you may not activate that melatonin. You may not turn it on for its protective capacities, okay? So in treating COVID or preventing COVID, whatever you want to call it here, in children who are in the spectrum, the vast majority of you are undermethylated. Correcting methylation is going to be very, very important. So that's one of those things you should do. If you're not with a very good physician who understands methylation or how to treat methylation, find one, because that's going to be very important. Next slide. So treating and preventing children with autism and preventing them from COVID. First of all, you've got to support the blood-brain barrier, as we've been talking about. Treating the Pyrrole Disorder and other chemical imbalances, healing the leaky gut, decrease inflammation, handle oxidative stress, dietary regulation. We haven't talked much about diet yet, but I want to say a few words. Folks, we know your kids love those McNuggets. We know they love all the starchy foods. They're basically little individuals who have yeast running around the GI.tract. Those yeast love the carbs, and that's why you do what you do. But folks, carbs are inflammatory. Those McNuggets are dipped in all sorts of wonderful glycosylated elements, deep fried, reglycosylated. They're inflammation on steroids. That's what those foods are. And we wonder why our children's behavior is totally dysregulated. Well, we've got to stop that, okay? Get rid of the inflammatory foods like grains, cereals. I mean, dairy and sweets, we've heard about that, but grains and cereals, many folks don't realize those things are very inflammatory. And if those are inflammatory, the GI tract becomes inflamed. If the GI tract becomes inflamed, it becomes leaky. If it's leaky, then all the bacterial agents, all the fungi, all those agents that are producing toxins are now sending those toxins into your child's bloodstream to go to your brain and other parts of the body, where they also create immunological inflammatory situations. And the whole spiraling cascade goes down. Now, I might sound a little bit contradictory here, but I'm also talking about caution with regard to vegetable diets and high concentrations of vegetables, especially dark green leafy vegetables. Because our children, now folks, I'm not talking about your physical health. I know people are going to start asking a whole bunch of questions and saying, "God doesn't know what he's talking about." But when we look at the concentration of folates, folates are present in high amounts in dark green leafy vegetables, okay? And if your child's diet is high, what folates do is that they actually steal methyl molecules from your child's system. Now, there are doctors out there going to say, "Oh, that's not correct. Everybody knows that folates are methylating agents." Yes, they are. But the question is, where are they methylating agents? Folks, when you have a cell, you have a nucleus or core of the cell, which gives all the instructions. That's where your DNA sits, in the nucleus of the cell. Methylation is most important in the DNA or the nucleus of the cell. So that's where you've got to concentrate all your methyl molecules. When you enter the cell, outside of the nucleus is called the cytoplasm. That's where folic acid, folate, methylated folate, whatever FOL version you want to come up with, it provides methyl. It's a powerful methylation donor outside of the nucleus of the cell. But then it dives into the nucleus of the cell and removes 10 times as much methyl as it ever donated. Now remember, it's the DNA when it comes to children with autism, children with the spectrum, folks who've got methylation issues. It's the DNA that we're trying to shift and re-regulate into normal functionality to help correct any of these challenges, from schizophrenia to bipolar to ADHD to autism. Methylation is key. So a diet that is high in dark green leafy vegetables actually is high in folates. Those folates will, yes, provide maybe one methyl molecule outside the nucleus, then dive into the nucleus, and it becomes a functional demethylating agent, which is why we say you have to be careful with regard to the high amounts of dark green leafy vegetables that are given. Now, some of you out there are saying, well, that's not a big deal. My kid will eat vegetables for the life of him. That's fine. But we're just sharing, for those of you out there who love your veggies and your kids eat very pristine diets, that can still be a problem, okay? So some key factors here: dealing with inflammation, dealing with oxidative stress, dealing with appropriate dietary regimens, rebalancing chemistry, rebalancing the brain, rebalancing neurotransmitter function, rebalancing activation, helping to support the immune system. These are all key elements that need to be in place in order to provide the most optimum capacity for our kids who are in the spectrum, as well as all of us for that matter. But these kids in particular, they're very important from a physical perspective. They're already going to be stressed because since we've got this whole pandemic thing going on, their routines have changed. And folks, you know your kids who are in the spectrum enjoy their routines. It weirds them out to no one's business when they deviate from routine. So now they're no longer going perhaps to ABA. They may not be going, which is applied behavioral analysis. They may not be going to their schools. They may not be going to their parks. They may be traveling different directions in the car to get from point A to point B. All those things stress out your kids. And that leads to more and more difficulties, more and more challenges. So this other side we can do ourselves to try to help combat that, and then just be patient. Your children will adjust over time. Okay.
Dr. Mensah, we just got a question in since you were talking about, so you can't eat, you shouldn't eat dairy and sweets and carbs, but you also have to be careful with high veggie diets. One of our viewers just said, all right, so give us an example of what's a good meal. You've just eliminated just about everything.
Well, I'll tell you, while we talked about the whole idea of methylation, so what we're really talking about is eating for your chemistry, right? And we've talked about this before. But folks, if you are undermethylated, I'm not talking about anyone's personal beliefs, religious beliefs, or anything else. Here are the simple biochemical facts, the truths. If you're undermethylated, you need to be on a higher protein diet. And not artificial proteins, using the natural proteins that come from basically animal type products. Whether it is chicken, fish, turkey, eggs, beef, whatever have you, there are nutritionists that can help you create that dietary plan. That's just part one. We're not saying don't eat vegetables. Not at all are we saying that. We're saying minimize, don't over-concentrate the folate-rich vegetables. All you researchers out there online, and I'm talking about the parents who love to Google, yeah, you're undermethylated, I know you, you're the ones watching this stuff. You can go online and check vegetables that are rich in folates and minimize the top 10. We're not saying totally eliminate, we're talking about minimizing them. Now that's assuming you check your child's chemistry, right? So we don't do without first evaluating what the individual person's unique chemistry happens to be. Because that same person who's undermethylated may have copper toxicity. And the kids in the spectrum are almost all uniformly, 90% of the time, they're high copper, Pyrrole disorder, low zinc, undermethylated individuals. Now, what does that mean? Unfortunately, a lot of the foods that our kids love are also high in copper. We've got foods that, shellfish, for example, those folks who like a lot of different seafood, it's also high in copper. So what the heck do you do? Okay. You're very careful. You weigh and balance, not eliminating all the foods, but what we're talking about is minimizing extreme concentrations. Quite honestly, our ancestors, our great-grandparents are much smarter than we were. They always said, eat a balanced diet, right? It's when we go to the extremes, trying to get to perfection, we get into trouble. A balanced diet, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, we're usually okay. But when we eat all these carbs and all these things that modern day society tells us it's good to eat, we get into trouble because the bacteria, the yeast in our systems now do a tremendous amount of damage because they get inflamed, and now they love it. They start to produce toxins that go out into our system and causes inflammation. So a good diet, number one, is more or less a balanced diet. That's number one. If you've got undermethylation, we're not saying don't give any vegetables at all. We're saying your proportions have to be different, right? Greater proportions of proteins relative to the greens. If you're undermethylated, we also say, take a look at the vegetables you provide. Not all vegetables are high in folates. We're talking about minimizing, I said minimizing, not eliminating, the high folate diets, okay? So then you check on copper, and then you might want to add some foods that are rich in zinc, okay? So these are things that can be done from a dietary perspective. It takes a little bit of time and education, but I know many of you are up at 3 o'clock in the morning Googling everything with regard to supporting your kids. You can spend some time doing that as well. But the best part is you've actually got some wonderful clinical nutritionists. Samantha Gilbert in California, spelled Gilbert, Gilbert, is a wonderful clinical nutritionist that can help guide you through helping you design a dietary plan or discussing foodstuffs to help you eat for your chemistry as well as your condition. So the kids, for example, with autism who have phenol sensitivities or who have oxalate issues or any of those things, there's help for you and guidance and direction. And at the same time, it helps to optimize your own system's capacity to fight illness and infection, to help you survive and thrive even in the course of the pandemic.
One of our viewers just commented about your comments regarding a balanced diet and just made the good point, I believe, that how these things are cooked, how this balanced diet is cooked is also important, in essence, saying we shouldn't be frying everything.
Absolutely, no question about that. And let me just say, it's implicit in our discussion,
right,
that how we prepare our foods is extremely important. We've got reams of volumes of information, of cookbooks all over the place to tell you, so much of regular cooking actually depletes the nutrient value from the foods that we eat. Okay, so yes, absolutely, how you cook is extremely important, not just throwing together a balanced meal. We've had so many people so ridiculously deficient, and they're shocked because they think that they eat wonderfully well, and they don't realize that how they're preparing their foods has made them extremely deficient in elements like zinc and a few others that are so important, like vitamin C. Okay, good question, or good point, I should say.
Absolutely, absolutely. Here's a question that came in actually before we got started. Someone who sent a question in before, who asked, how do we address, how do we help people, especially people on the spectrum, who stubbornly refuse to take COVID precautions, like wearing a mask? You mentioned before that oftentimes people with autism have difficulty dealing with new things or changes from their routine. If these folks are struggling with the new routine of wearing a mask or things along those lines, how do we help those individuals?
In the best way you can. Okay, you do your best. But see, here's the point. We wouldn't be having these conversations if all the mechanisms we had in place to protect us with COVID worked 100%. They don't. So what we're trying to do is to help provide for you the tools to optimize your own immune defenses, so that if you get exposed, when you get exposed, the damage is minimal, the time frame is minimal, and you thrive instead of having tremendous sequelae and serious conditions that evolve or happen. The vast majority of children or individuals who are in the spectrum that you typically encounter are indeed children. So naturally, yes, there are much higher levels of melatonin, but at the same time, if they're undermethylated, that melatonin may not be activated the way it should. So we have to be cautionary about that. And you folks out there love your glutathione, transdermal glutathione, and otherwise. These are very important pieces to help your immune system fight infection as well, because without glutathione, your lymphocyte production, as I said, decreases 75%. So helping to doing all these things helps you to wear the most powerful armor your system is able to provide in this battle against COVID. And what we're looking to do is to help you optimize that armor.
At the risk of sounding political, you often make this same statement. We're trying not to be political here, but also, if everyone else were to wear those masks, then we could suppress the spread of the virus such that our few autistic kids that have difficulty changing their routine might not be in quite so much danger.
That is very true. And as you said, we're not trying to get political. You know what? This is really just kind of silly. I'm just going to put it like this. Look, there's science and there's fact. You can believe whatever you want to believe. You can do what you want to do. But at the end of the day, if you jump off of Mount Rushmore and think you can fly and believe you can fly, I have news for you. You're going to hit the earth. And it's going to be hard. Those are just the laws of nature. What we're talking about, your most wonderful doctors and scientists out there are really trying to help everyone understand the facts and how the science works. Believe me, the mechanisms are far more complicated than what you're being told on average. These folks are making it sound really simple because they're giving you the simple baseline summary. There's a tremendous amount of scientific understanding everywhere from immune function to genetics to environmental stressors that affect micromolecules you've never ever heard of. And these guys and ladies, these wonderful folks are spending a tremendous amount of time trying to give you information to help you not only survive, but thrive. These are not whimsical curiosities. These are facts. The fact is, if you light a match and you touch that match, you're going to burn your hand. It doesn't matter what you believe. Okay? And I know someone out there is thinking, well, if you're a third-degree yogi and you learn not how to, well, yeah, maybe then, but most of us aren't that person. Okay? We've got to take this seriously. These are things that just happen, and mechanical barriers may not be 100%, but they can provide a great deal of protection against viral load. In other words, how much of the virus you actually get exposed to can be helped and blocked by wearing a mask. The lower the number of virus molecules you're exposed to, the better off you are. The better off, the better. This is very important. Mechanical barriers of any type are helpful around the nose and the mouth. And it is not just the mouth. This is not protection, okay? There are tons of viral particles in the nasal cavities, tons. And so you must have a mask that truly covers the nose and the mouth, okay? So, all right, I'm gonna de-escalate here and we're going to come back to normal discussion.
Sorry, I didn't mean to ramp you up there, Doc.
Well, you know that those my biscuits, Mr. Wells.
We've got another question that was sent in beforehand asking, how does one treat our special needs individuals who might actually get COVID, especially if they are able to remain at home? So we're not putting them in the hospital and putting them on that IV vitamin C that you mentioned before. How do we help those patients that are special needs but staying home get through the ravages of COVID?
Okay, well, now here's where our considerations have to be dealt with for the specific individual. What are their comorbid conditions? Now, let's face it, folks, a lot of our kids are now beyond chubby, okay? And if they are heavy children, they are now at increased risk. If they are asthmatic individuals, just because you have a spectrum disorder doesn't mean you can't have asthma. So now we've got two comorbid conditions. The comorbid conditions now tell us we've got to up the ante, okay? The dosing that we're talking about, and I'm not going to get too specific because it is case specific. I can't get a general construct out to everyone. But what we've talked about thus far gets increased big time, okay? Especially in the realm of vitamin C. That piece gets tremendously larger in terms of units if necessary once you actually get COVID. So get testing, first of all. If you're not on nutrient therapy or a nutrient program, start with what it is we've given. It's right there for you in terms of the dosing on our slides. So start there, call your doctor, call the ER, call whomever it is, and then let's see how things go. Monitor your children very, very carefully, step by step, okay? And if things get really bad, just take them to the emergency room, especially respiratory issues. Remember what we talked about with regard to the displacement of vitamin C and drowning in a sea or starving in a sea of oxygen. It's kind of like being out in a boat on the ocean for 30 days. You can't drink the water. And you can't drink the water sitting in a boat on something that is water, okay, because of the salt content. Well, that's kind of like what happens in the system, which is why mechanical ventilators really don't work very well, because they just move air in and out of your lungs. But if there's no exchange of oxygen for carbon dioxide, because oxygen can't bind to the red blood cells, because COVID got in there and set the whole system in disarray, you starve in a sea of oxygen. So the vitamin C is helping to rebind and reconnect, at least in part, that whole process so that you can bind oxygen and getting your immune system hyped up, revved up, and looking to do a good job. So high dosages of vitamin C, very important. High dosages of zinc, very important. If you can't get your special needs child to do more than swallow 2 things, those are the 2 you need to do. If you can get them to chew a gummy, make melatonin part of the issue as well. Folks, we've not exhausted the scheme, but these are some of our most important and consistently necessary elements because they bear direct physiologic relationship to what COVID does in the system. Yes, vitamin D is good, it's very important. A variety of things can be great antioxidants, but here's exactly what COVID affects and how and why and the problems that's created. So in order to deal with those effects, we've got to counteract them, okay? You don't want to put a Band-Aid on your engine when it's broken. You want to replace the parts of the engine that's broken so that your car functions well. That's what this is about.
We've got one last question that was sent in before, and we seem to have exhausted the questions that folks have in the audience. Although, let's give you folks one last chance. If you do have any last second questions, then get them to us right away. Use that Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. But the last question that we have here asks, if COVID seems to be worse in people with inflammatory conditions, you've talked a lot about inflammatory conditions today.
Yes.
Why was there such concern about people taking certain anti-inflammatory medicines like ibuprofen?
Mm-hmm. Excellent question. The issue is that when we look at inflammation, inflammation is one word, but it is thousands and thousands of reactions. So which part of inflammation are we talking about? Are we talking about the initial stages of inflammation? Are we talking about cytokine productions? Are we talking about molecules you've never heard of, perhaps like interleukins? Are we talking about coenzymes or other factors in the system that are affected by different aspects of inflammation? Okay, that's where things got tricky. So on the one hand, it says, well, okay, well, you know what? You can't take these particular anti-inflammatories because they affect the system in this way. But you can take certain anti-inflammatories because they do that, like steroids. But even then, before that, there was a condition or a situation where we weren't sure steroids were a good thing to do or to take. Okay, but things are changing. But right now, the stance really still is that things like ibuprofen really should not be taken, okay, as that version of an anti-inflammatory agent. The anti-inflammatories that we've been talking about are elements that directly target a very specific part of the COVID process. And they work very, very well to do that. So they undo what COVID is trying to do, as opposed to dealing with somewhere way down the line in inflammation that can produce a somewhat detrimental effect or a hindrance to reactivation of appropriate inflammatory capacities. Okay, so basically, what is typically an anti-inflammatory, like an ibuprofen, challenges the system at a different level than where the natural anti-inflammatories that we're talking about are working to stop the COVID process. Very specific receptor sites, et cetera, et cetera. Very complicated web. It's a great question, though.
Great. Well, and I guess we can close on a great question. Do you have any final words of wisdom for us, Dr. Mensah?
Well, I'll get to that, but there's one thing that I know I probably need to talk about, because I can hear my partner, Dr. Bowman's voice in this. She's saying, listen, don't forget to talk about diarrhea with vitamin C, okay? So first of all, I say, if your child is clogged up, hey, give them tons of vitamin C, wish them out, okay? Got to clean out the constipation. But the other thing is, I know someone out there has thought about this too. I take vitamin C and I get diarrhea. What about that? I say two things. First of all, there's the concept of severe illness and diarrhea. You kind of have to err on the caution side of, let's get rid of the severe illness and just deal with the diarrhea. But diarrhea actually, if you get diarrhea while taking high dosages of vitamin C, your system is actually telling you there's something wrong internally with your GI tract, okay? Because not everyone gets it. So then you really need to explore further at the right time what's going on with your GI tract such that you get diarrhea from vitamin C. You really shouldn't. Also, something very fascinating happens with this COVID process. As you take vitamin C and you have COVID, your system kind of says, hey, hold on, we're not going to have that diarrhea. We need that vitamin C thing. And your diarrhea actually goes down as you continue to take the vitamin C. I don't mean travel down and leave your body. I mean, the whole diarrhea process simmers down. So that's one of those things I want you to understand. Some folks can get diarrhea with vitamin C, high dosage. Take it anyway, because this is life or death. This is neurological consequences. This is key. This is important. But also, that should damper down over time. That is the diarrhea. So that's one thing I do want to mention. The other thing is, look, just be safe. We're all trying to find the best way to help everyone thrive, not just survive. You know, we have, it's such a very heavy and difficult time period that we're in right now with the pandemic. And lives are being lost. And now people are talking about loss of life like it's a casual thing. At least some people are. Folks, if you've ever lost a person in your life, that doesn't ever go away. That person is always a memory, a loving pain in many respects. And we have a very interesting policy and philosophy at Mensah Medical and amongst the people that we know and care about, which is zero death policy. When I lost a couple of friends from med school, for a variety of reasons, cancer, breast cancer for one, I said if I ever came across anything that I knew would help prevent the loss of life, I would stop at nothing, for the most part, nothing legal, to accomplish and to help people. So now we're in a situation where we have information, and that's why we do this. Because to me, if we lose one person, that should have never happened. Never. If society needs to be shut down in order to help keep people alive, and I know this is controversial, but I'm going to say it, people make up society, okay? If you don't have people, you don't have society. Who knows how many Rembrandts, who knows how many wonderful scientists, how many doctors, how many engineers, how many lawyers are not going to be here. Children have already lost their dads, their moms, who are in their 20s and 30s, and they're not going to have that wonderful interaction around prom, around wisdom, around knowledge. I can go on and on and on. You get where I'm coming from. We take this very seriously. So for me, the debate is very different. The debate is, if we're losing one life, that's one too many. So we're here to help. That's just our job. That's our calling, and that is our honor. So I love movies, so I'm just going to say, in the words of Bill and Ted coming out soon, be excellent to one another. Let's be excellent.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Mensah. And thanks to all of you who have tuned in today and joined us for this important conversation. As we remind you each week, so we will remind you again today that this presentation, the video replay of this webinar, will be available on YouTube later on this evening, just go to YouTube and type in Mensah Medical. You'll find the Mensah Medical channel that has the links for the video replays of all of our Coping with COVID webinars that we've produced over these last several months. We encourage you also to share this with your friends and family. Let folks know that they can tune in. If you know of folks that have children on the spectrum, that are supporting individuals that are on the spectrum, and you think this information that we've shared with you today is important stuff that they need to hear, they'll be able to get to it. Just go to YouTube and go to the Mensah Medical channel there. We'll also post links to this on the Mensah Medical Facebook page, so you should be able to find this very easily. Dr.
Mr.
Vincent,
Wells,
have another point?
tell them how they can find us if they have any questions.
Absolutely. If we always encourage folks to give us a call at the Mensah Medical office. Phone number there is 630-256-8308. Certainly you can go to mensahmedical.com on the World Wide Web and find our website there. And again, the Mensah Medical YouTube channel, the Mensah Medical Facebook page, all of those places have links that can get you back to us where we can provide help and support as it is needed. We encourage you to join us again next week. We're going to continue these conversations. We've got sessions coming up in the very near future to talk about suicide prevention during this time of social isolation. We've got sessions that are going to continue to talk about just managing our mental health in general, resiliency, strategies that we can use to overcome just the stresses of coping with COVID and so much more. So be sure to join us again next week, as we joked last week. Same bat time, same bat channel. We'll be here on Thursday at 4 o'clock next week, and we encourage you to join us. Until then, thank you so much for being with us, and stay safe, stay home, wear your masks, all those good things. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Mr. Wells.